It was an autumn morning at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, when Lieutenant Maya Johnson crossed the outer perimeter of the military base with her cup of coffee still steaming. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, creating an almost poetic contrast with the gray, utilitarian structures that dominated the base's land. Maya was 28 years old, with skin as dark as mahogany, curly hair always impeccably tied back in a military bun, and a sense of duty so strong that her colleagues sometimes joke she must have been born in uniform. A West Point graduate of 5 years prior, Maya was one of the few black women in a command position in. Not that it bothered her, she was used to being the exception, the statistical anomaly. Ever since she decided to pursue a military career against the wishes of her mother, who dreamed of seeing her as a doctor or lawyer. Something safer, her mother always said, as if security were a luxury that people like them could choose in the world. On that particular morning, Maya was conducting a routine inspection in a remote area of the base, a storage section rarely visited except by the few personnel assigned to maintenance. It was then that she saw him for the first time, an elderly man, perhaps in his 70s, sitting on a makeshift bench made of wooden crates, wearing a battered military jacket that looked like it had seen better days decades ago. Maya stopped a few meters from him, her posture immediately shifting to something between professional caution and genuine curiosity. "Sir, this is a restricted area. Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice firm but not hostile. The man slowly raised his gaze, as if emerging from a deep. His eyes, a faded blue, seemed clouded not only by age, but by something Maya recognized immediately, the same distant look she had seen in veterans who carried more than just medals from their wars. "Sergeant Thomas Elliott, 82nd Airborne Division, sir," he replied, automatically trying to stand up and almost tripping in the process. Maya quickly approached to steady him, noticing the trembling in his hand and the unmistakable smell of someone who hadn't had access to a shower in a while. "Make yourself comfortable, Sergeant," she said, helping him to sit down again. "What are you doing here?" Thomas looked around as if he too were trying to find the answer to that question. "I live here," he said finally, pointing to a small makeshift structure not far away, partially hidden behind some equipment containers. "They said I could stay until my paperwork was processed." Maya felt a knot in her stomach. She knew military paperwork well, bureaucratic nonsense that could take weeks, months, or even years to resolve. And, judging by the man's condition, it seemed he had been waiting a very long time. "Who said you could stay?" she asked gently. "Colonel Matthews," Thomas replied promptly. "But that was, well, I guess it's been a while." Maya knew Colonel Matthews only by reputation. He had retired almost 3 years ago, which meant that Thomas had probably been living in that forgotten corner of the base for at least all that time, invisible to the system that was supposed to take care of him. At that moment, Maya made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. She wouldn't report Thomas to the base authorities immediately. First, she needed to understand his situation, find out what had happened to his case. Why a decorated veteran like him, for she could see the medals stitched onto his old jacket, was living like a ghost in the back of a military base. "Are you hungry, Sergeant Elliott?" she asked, extending her hand. Thomas hesitated for a moment before accepting. "Someone has been calling me about my post for a long time," he said with a small smile. That's how it began. Maya took Thomas to the officer's mess, ignoring the curious glances. She sat with him and listened to his story while he ate with the veracity of someone who didn't know when he would have another full meal. Thomas had served in Vietnam, then in the Gulf. He had been wounded twice and received the Bronze Star for bravery. After his retirement, he had worked as a private security guard for a few years, until health problems, both physical and mental, began to make the job impossible. His marriage did not survive his nightly nightmares and subsequent alcoholism. His children were scattered across the country, distant not only geographically but emotionally. When he lost his home due to mounting medical debt, Thomas returned to the only family he knew, the Army. He had arrived at Fort Bragg to sort out issues with his veteran benefits, but the system seemed to have swallowed him up and forgotten him. Colonel Matthews, an old friend from his service days, had allowed him to stay temporarily in a little-used area of the base while his case was reviewed. But then Matthews retired, and no one remembered Thomas anymore. "Why didn't you seek help?" Maya asked, genuinely perplexed. Thomas shrugged, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of all his disappointments. "I've filled out more forms than I can count, Lieutenant. I've gone from office to office. At some point, you just get tired of begging." Maya knew this story well. Her own uncle, also a veteran, had faced similar battles with bureaucracy. The difference was that her uncle had a family to support him, to help him navigate the maze of paperwork and requirement. Thomas was alone. She should have reported the situation immediately. It was standard procedure. But Maya knew what would happen. Dorwood would be removed from the base, possibly face charges of intrusion, and then thrown back into the same system that had already failed him. Instead, she did something risky. She decided to help him on her own, discreetly, while trying to unravel what had happened to his case. In the following weeks, Maya established a routine. She brought food to Thomas, ensured he had clean blankets and adequate clothing, and spent her free hours helping him rebuild his makeshift shelter to make it more resistant to the approaching winter. More importantly, she immersed herself in the bureaucracy of Veterans Affairs, filling out forms, making calls, and trying to locate Thomas's lost file. It wasn't easy keeping everything a secret. Maya had to be careful, making up excuses for her absence, taking supplies in small quantities so as not to arouse suspicion. Some of her colleagues began to notice her frequent trips to the remote area of the base, but she deflected the questions with stories about an inventory project or reconnaissance exercises. Sergeant Wilson, her immediate superior, came closest to discovering the truth, approaching her after a meeting. "Johnson, you've been spending a lot of time in that storage area," he commented, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Is there something I should know?" "Just being meticulous, sir," she replied, keeping her face impassive. "I found some discrepancies in the inventory that I'm checking." Wilson didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press any further either. "Just make sure this doesn't interfere with your regular duties." "Yes, sir," Maya replied, feeling the weight of the lie, something that went against all her principles. But what else could she do? The system had already failed Thomas once. She didn't trust that it wouldn't fail again. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Maya began to discover more about Thomas. He wasn't just a forgotten veteran. He was a man with a lifetime of story, a talent for drawing, and a profound knowledge of classical literature that surprised Maya. In their conversations during the meals they shared, he spoke of poetry and philosophy with the same ease with which he discussed military tactics. "You seem surprised," he once remarked, when he saw her gazing in admiration at a sketch he had made of the bases. "Landscapes." "I am," she admitted. "I never imagined that an old-school sergeant would be so versatile." Thomas laughed, a hoarse sound like crumpled paper. "Before I was a sergeant, I was a young black man from Chicago who wanted to be an artist. Life has a funny way of changing our plans." Maya could understand that. She herself had dreamed of being a pianist before life led her down a different path. It was strange how she and Thomas, separated by race, gender, and generation, had more in common than it seemed at first glance. It was during one of these moments of connection that Thomas finally asked what must have been on his mind for months. "Why are you helping me, Lieutenant? You're risking your career for an old man most people would rather pretend doesn't exist." Maya thought for a moment before answering. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said simply, "and because no one should be forgotten, especially someone who gave so much to their country." The truth was more complex. Maya saw in Thomas not just a man who needed help, but a reflection of what could happen to any of them to herself, perhaps if the world decided to turn its back on them. Furthermore, there was something profoundly wrong with the system that allowed its veterans to fall through the cracks, especially those who carried visible and invisible scars from their service. Meanwhile, her search for Thomas's documents was slowly bearing fruit. She discovered that his case had been incorrect marked and sent to a regional office in another state. It was taking time, but she was gradually putting together the necessary information to rectify the situation. Winter arrived in full force, bringing with it frigid temperatures that transformed the base into an almost Arctic landscape. Maya grew increasingly worried about Thomas's ability to survive in the precarious conditions, especially given his already fragile health. She began searching for a more permanent solution, something that could pull him out of that bureaucratic limbo before it was too. That's when she made an even riskier decision. She contacted a civilian organization that supports veterans, explaining Thomas's situation without revealing that he was living illegally on the base. The organization took an interest in the case and assigned a pro bono lawyer, Patricia Reyes, to help. Patricia was an energetic and determined woman, a former soldier who had become a lawyer specifically to help other veterans. She met with Maya off base several times, reviewing the documents Maya had managed to gather. "This is a classic case of institutional negligence," Patricia said after her third meeting. "But we have enough here to initiate a formal process and expedite the review of his benefits." What? Patricia didn't know what Maya deliberately omitted was exactly where Thomas was living. Maya feared that revealing the whole truth could compromise both Thomas and herself. Things started moving more quickly. After that, with Patricia's help, Thomas's case was located and began to advance through the system. Maya could see a light at the end of the tunnel, a moment when Thomas would finally receive the recognition and support he deserved. But then, on one particularly brutal day in January, it all fell apart. Maya was carrying hot food and medicine to Thomas when she noticed something different. There were fresh tire tracks in the snow leading to the area where Thomas was. Her heart raced as she quickened her pace, a bad feeling growing in her chest. As she approached the makeshift shelter, she heard voices, several of them, all tense. Turning the corner, she came upon a scene she would never forget. 4 men in expensive suits, clearly uncomfortable in the cold, but each sporting a discreet weapon at their waist. They were surrounding Thomas, who looked smaller and more frail than ever in his worn jacket. "Lieutenant Johnson," one of the men said upon seeing her. His tone indicated that he already knew exactly who she was. "How convenient. We were about to send someone to pick her up." Maya felt her blood run cold, and it wasn't because of the weather. "Who are you?" she asked, automatically positioning herself between the men and Thomas. The man who had spoken stepped forward, pulling an identification card from the inside pocket of his jacket. "Graham Mitchell, Department of Justice. And these are my colleagues, also from the Military Prosecutor's Office. Lawyers. 4. Armed lawyers in the middle of a military base." Maya's mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. "What does that mean?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling slightly, not just from the cold. "It means, Mr. Elliot, that your situation has finally caught the attention of the right people," Mitchell replied, his smile not reaching his eye. "Or perhaps the wrong people, depending on your perspective." That's when Maya understood. Patricia must have discovered where Thomas was really living. And instead of keeping it a secret, she had taken the matter to higher authorities, possibly hoping to force faster action. The plan had backfired spectacularly. "Lieutenant Johnson," Mitchell continued, "are you aware that harboring an unauthorized civilian on military premises is a direct violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice? Not to mention falsifying reports and misappropriating military resources." Maya felt the weight of each word like a physical blow. Her career, everything she had worked for, now hung by a thread. But strangely, at that moment, that wasn't her biggest concern. "And what about him?" she asked, indicating Thomas with a nod. "What happens to him now?" One of the other lawyers, a middle-aged woman with eyes as sharp as blades, replied, "Mr. Elliot will be escorted off the base immediately. Depending on the outcome of our investigation, he could face civil charges of trespassing and misuse of federal property." "This is ridiculous!" Maya exploded, her composure finally breaking. "He's a decorated veteran whose paperwork was lost by the very system that was supposed to protect him. He came here looking for help and was forgotten. The only thing he hacked was a system that abandoned him." His impassioned speech was met with impassive expressions. These were men and women dealing with regulations and statutes, not with moral justice or human compassion. "Your concerns have been noted, Lieutenant," Mitchell said coldly. Now please step aside, so we can finish our work." It was Thomas who surprised everyone, stepping forward with a dignity that seemed to defy his precarious situation. "Lieutenant Johnson was only doing what all of you should have done," he said, his voice finding a strength Maya hadn't heard in months. "If anyone should face consequences, it's me." She simply showed the compassion that the rest of the system seems to have forgotten. Mitchell observed Thomas for a long moment, something in his gaze subtly shifting. "Mr. Elliot, I served in Iraq. I have immense respect for men, but there are protocols that must be followed." "Protocols," Thomas repeated with a bitter laugh. "It was precisely because of your protocols that I ended up living in a box for almost 4 years. The silence that followed was almost tangible, heavy with uncomfortable truths that no one wanted to acknowledge. It was broken by a radio from one of the lawyers, announcing that a vehicle was on its way to transport Thomas. While they waited, Maya stayed by Thomas's side, ignoring the lawyer's stares. She had spent months helping this man, listening to his stories, sharing meals with him. She wouldn't abandon him now, even if it meant the end of her career. "I'm sorry," she whispered to him. "I should have done more, found a better solution." Thomas shook his head. "You've done more than anyone else has bothered to do in years, Lieutenant. Don't apologize for being human in a system designed to strip us of our humanity." The vehicle arrived, an unmarked black SUV that seemed out of place in the military landscape. 2 security officers got out, ready to escort Thomas. Before they could approach, however, another vehicle appeared, this one clearly marked with Veterans Affairs insignia. From the second car emerged a woman whom Maya immediately recognized, Patricia Reyes, the lawyer she had contacted. Behind her came a man in a general's uniform, 3 stars shining on his shoulder. "What is this?" Mitchell asked, clearly not expecting this turn of events. Patricia smiled, a gesture that showed all her teeth and no joy. "This, Mr. Mitchell, is what happens when you try to do your job without doing your homework properly." She approached, extending a folder to Mitchell. "Temporary court order preventing the removal of Sergeant Thomas Elliot from military facilities until his case is resolved." "And also," she added, handing over another document, "a complete review of his benefits file. Signed by the Secretary of Veterans Affairs this morning." Mitchell flipped through the documents, his face a mask of confusion and restrained anger. That doesn't change the fact that he was illegally residing on a military facility with the help of an active duty officer. That's when the general stepped forward. "Actually, it does change." He introduced himself to Thomas first, offering a formal salute that made the old soldier instinctively straighten his shoulders. "Sergeant Elliot, General Howard Blackburn, it's an honor to meet you." Then he turned to Mitchell. "Mr. Mitchell, your concern for protocols is admirable, but perhaps you would like to review Department of Defense Directive 4.37, which establishes special procedures for decorated veterans seeking resolution of disputed benefit. A directive implemented, I might add, after the 2021 scandal when we discovered that dozens of veterans had died while waiting for their cases to be resolved." Maya watched the scene unfold as if it were a dream. She didn't know of any Directive 4.37. She strongly suspected nobody did because it probably didn't exist. What she was witnessing was a 3-star general essentially bluffing to protect a forgotten veteran and, by extension, the junior officer who had risked everything to help him. Mitchell wasn't convinced. Even if such a directive exists, that doesn't justify Lieutenant Johnson's actions. She lied in official reports, she misappropriated funds, she followed the spirit, if not the letter, of our oath, General Blackburn interrupted. "Don't abandon any soldier. That applies as much to those still serving as to those who have served." The tension was palpable as the 2 men stared at each other. Finally, it was Mitchell who looked away. "I'll need to consult my superior," he said sternly. "Do it," the general replied. "Meanwhile, Sergeant Elliot will remain in Veterans Affairs custody in appropriate facilities on base until his case is resolved. As for Lieutenant Johnson," he continued, turning to Maya, "she will be temporarily assigned as the liaison officer for the case, reporting directly to my office." Maya could hardly believe what she was hearing. Not only was Thomas safe, but her own career seemed to have been saved by an almost miraculous intervention. "General," she began. unsure how to express her gratitude. "We'll talk later, Lieutenant," he said, his tone professional, but his eyes communicating much more. "For now, help Sergeant Elliot gather his belongings. You two have a new mission." And so it was that on a cold January morning, 4 armed lawyers who came to enforce the law to the letter ended up being overcome by something more powerful: the stubborn humanity of a young black lieutenant who refused to accept that the rules mattered more than the people they were supposed to protect. In the months that followed, Thomas's case became a catalyst for change in the system. General Blackburn, it was later revealed, had lost a brother to suicide after a similar struggle with the bureaucracy of veterans' benefits. He turned Thomas's case into his personal mission, using it as an example of the need for Patricia Reyes, the lawyer who had inadvertently triggered the crisis by reporting the situation to the wrong authority, redeemed herself by leading the legal team that ultimately unlocked not only Thomas's benefits, but also substantial compensation for years of negligence. As for Maya, she received both a formal reprimand and a recommendation for promotion, a bureaucratic paradox that seemed aptly symbolic. Her career continued, marked by a reputation for unwavering integrity and an irritating tendency to her superiors to question orders that prioritized procedures over people. Thomas finally received the medical care he desperately needed and eventually moved into a small apartment near the base. He became a regular presence in the mentoring program for young soldiers that Maya helped establish, sharing his art, his wisdom, and most importantly, his stories. The friendship between the two, the young black lieutenant and the older white sergeant, continued to flourish, transcending divisions of race, age, and rank. They met regularly for lunch in the same mess hall where they had shared their first meal. Now, as equals, both transformed by the shared experience. On one of those occasions, almost a year after the events that brought them together, Thomas presented Maya with a framed drawing, a portrait of her in her uniform, positioned between him and the 4 lawyers, her face determined and defiant. "To remind me," Maya asked, admiring the detailed work, "or for you to remember?" Thomas smiled, the wrinkles on his face telling stories of pain and now, finally, of some peace. "To remind anyone who sees it that sometimes it only takes one person who cares more about what is right than what is easy, to change an entire system." Maya stared at the portrait for a long moment. "I didn't do this to change the system," she said finally. "I did it because you needed help." Thomas nodded, understanding the profound truth in his word. "That's why you changed him." And in a world often defined by rule, bureaucracy, and the coldness of systems designed to process people instead of serving them, perhaps this was the most important lesson: that true change rarely comes from grand, calculated gestures, but from simple moments of human compassion. Soldier helping another, a hand extended at the right moment, the courage to do what is needed. That's right, even when 4 armed lawyers show up to tell you you're wrong.